Good morning, bad news. The United States is one of the biggest violators of international law and documented crimes against humanity. In fact, the United States has been repeatedly found guilty in supranational courts. And you may be hearing on TikTok that an international tribunal of legal experts found the US guilty of multiple human and civil rights violations against black, brown, and indigenous people through racist police killings, hyperincarceration, political retribution, environmental and public health discrimination, and a historic genocide against those groups. This is all absolutely true, and the case being made by the International Tribunal is indisputable. But unfortunately and importantly, this was a people's tribunal, which means that it was a non-governmental and non-judicial body and doesn't have actual legal power, unlike the United Nations International Court of Justice, which is the recognized body that can legally find countries guilty of crimes. But wait, guess what? The United Nations and the International Court of Justice have put the US on trial for violating international law over a dozen times, and the US has been found guilty repeatedly. So what actually happens when the US is found guilty of violating international law and committing crimes against humanity? Well, since the ICJ was created in 1964, the US has been on trial 15 times. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan directed the CIA to fund a rebellion against the elected Nicaraguan government, which the Reagan administration paid for by illegally selling weapons to Iran and facilitating the Colombian cocaine trade. This was known as the Iran-Contra affair, and it was very well documented with plenty of hard evidence. It was a blatant violation of Nicaragua's sovereignty and many treaties that prohibited governments from selling weapons and drugs to other countries. On every level, it was blatantly illegal. So in 1986, the ICJ presided over the case of Nicaragua versus the United States, with 291 judgments against the US. Obviously, after exposing overwhelming evidence, America was found guilty, and the ICJ ruled that they had to pay Nicaragua $17 billion in reparations. But of course, they didn't. Instead, the United States withdrew their support of the ICJ's authority, and because the US is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, they vetoed every attempt to enforce the ICJ's judgment on themselves. Literally, they pulled a get-out-of-jail-free card and nothing happened. And just 2 years later, the United States found itself in the International Court of Justice again, when the US Navy shot down an Iranian civilian aircraft flying in Iranian airspace. Killing civilians in their own country is an absolutely clear-cut international violation of law. 290 people died on Iran Air Flight 655, and it was the 9th worst aviation incident in history. But when the case came before the ICJ, the US categorically refused to admit fault or legal liability. They did, however, 8 years later, agree to pay $61.8 million to the families of the victims by using a legal principle that established this payment as a favor done out of kindness so that they didn't have to admit guilt. To this day, the United States government has never apologized and explicitly said that they never will. The third ICJ case occurred in 1999. 2 German nationals were executed by the US government for killing a man during a bank robbery. But by doing so, the United States violated a critical portion of the Vienna Convention, which says that foreign nationals have the right to get assistance from their consulate, and the US didn't let that happen. Again, they were found guilty, and even though they refused to accept the ICJ's ruling as legally binding, they did agree to never violate that specific portion of the Vienna Convention again. 2 years later, they violated that specific portion of the Vienna Convention again, this time with 54 Mexican nationals who were sentenced to death without informing the Mexican consulate. And again, the ICJ found the United States guilty, and this ruling required the US to change its conviction process for foreign nationals. A pretty obvious step to keep this from happening again. But instead of fixing the process, the United States withdrew from the section of the Vienna Convention that required them to adhere to the ICJ's ruling, thereby making it unenforceable. The problem is pretty obvious, right? The US simply doesn't adhere to international law. It's entirely too powerful and controls the legal bodies that can prosecute it. In fact, despite forcing nearly all other UN member nations to adhere to treaties like the Rome Statute, the Vienna Convention, and nuclear weapon and landmine bans, the US itself refuses to sign them and violates them all the time. It's such a blatant and ridiculous loophole that it's not really a legal principle, it's pure global arrogance. The United States is untouchable in international law, and they want the world to know. Thanks for watching Good Morning Bad News. If you want to see all of our sources for this episode 100% for free, or if you want to help support the channel and get some cool gifts like these mugs or these stickers, you can find us on Patreon, the link's in the bio.